I just want to welcome you today to our Readers Meet the Author with Dr. David Smith. I'm Jeffrey Archer, Dean of University Libraries, Museums, and the Press. And what better way to use spaces in the libraries besides printed materials on the shelves to actually have our own faculty have a dialogue with another faculty member over their works, and to have that sort of ideas. We just don't accept everything. You have an opportunity to engage. And that's what libraries do. And that's why it's exciting to host the Provost and President's program. Before we do get started, I do want to read our Baylor's land acknowledgement. And I challenge all of you to listen to the land acknowledgement, just not the first half. But we crafted our land acknowledgement to frame our actions going forward. So think about maybe ways that you might be able to lean into the second half of our land acknowledgement as you hear it read. We respectfully acknowledge that Baylor University in Waco and its original campus in Independence are on land and territories originally occupied by indigenous peoples, including the Waco and Tawakoni of the Wichita and affiliated tribes, the Tonkawa, the Comanche, Karankawa, and Lipan Apaches. These indigenous peoples were dispossessed of and removed from their lands over centuries by European colonization and American expansionism. In recognition that these native nations are the original stewards of Baylor's campus locations, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign native nations and indigenous communities through educational offerings, partnerships, and community service. Now welcome Dr. Nancy Brickhouse, our provost, to do the introductions.
Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I am really pleased to be at this event. It's one of the highlights of my week to be able to come here and just it's kind of the reason why we all became academics, was the opportunity to learn from our colleagues and really learn something new every day. And this event really is about introducing the campus community to works of scholarship by our own faculty. We give faculty an opportunity to talk about a book that they have written recently, one that is of general interest. And thus can engage a broad range of different people. I find this particular choice interesting because it is about defense in an age of rapid industrialization and technological change. There must be some lessons for today. And I found it inspiring that that even with the drive of changing technologies, it was at the end of the day vision that led George Dewey to make the kinds of decisions that he made. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. I think it's highly relevant. Or maybe the older you get, the more history becomes relevant to you. I'm not sure. But it is certainly touching on some familiar themes to us. I'll give a brief introduction to a couple of people here on campus that might not need a lot of introduction, but for perhaps guests, I'd like to introduce you first of all to the author, Dr. David Smith. He's a senior lecturer in the history department. He received his undergraduate and master's degree from what is now Texas State University in San Marcos, a place that he shares in common with Ron Johnson, who served on the faculty there prior to coming to Baylor. And he got his PhD in American history at the University of Missouri. He's written 5 books, including the volume under consideration today, published several journal articles, encyclopedia articles, book reviews, and contributed columns on art, culture, and politics that have appeared in the Weekly Standard, the Wall Street Journal, the Dallas Morning News, the Austin American Statesman, and the Waco Tribune Herald. You may have heard on NPR's Morning Edition or other national and regional radio shows, or even heard him play as part of a local band with some of his Baylor colleagues. That needs a question. We'll save it for the end, though. He's a member of the Naval Order of the United States and a beloved teacher, receiving awards here at Baylor and at the University of Missouri. And interviewing him today is Dr. Ronald Angelo Johnson, who is the Ralph and Bessie May Lynn Chair of History at Baylor. His research embraces a transnational approach to African American history in the early United States, with specializations in diplomacy, race, and religion. In 2014, he published Diplomacy in Black and White, John Adams' To Say L'Aventure. Did I do okay? Great. And their Atlantic World Alliance. Currently, he serves as the co-editor of the Journal of the Early Republic and is working on a book on racialized U.S. relations with Haiti during the American Revolution. So please welcome our two guests today, Dr. Smith and Dr. Johnson, and I will hand it over to them.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. And David, I don't know about you, but I just am so gratified as a historian that so many people, students, faculty, staff, friends, have shown up to talk about a history book.
Yeah. My bandmates are all here.
Yeah. And I think it just speaks to, I do think it speaks to the moment in which we're living and the relevancy of history to who we are today. And I do hope we can touch on some of that today. I do want to say, in reading this, you and I talked about this, but we've talked casually about the book. But as I read it, and throughout, one of the things I was just really struck by is, yes, we learn a lot about Admiral George Dewey in this book. We learn a lot about the transformation of the Navy in this book. We learn a lot about the expansion of the United States in this book, all of which we'll get a chance to talk about. But I found in this book a personal story of a man's life. So not only was the country changing, but you seemed to let the reader in on how he was changing and being changed along this process. And let me just start off with this. This book is incredibly accessible. It doesn't, I get the sense that anyone can read this book. Like, you don't have to have a deep knowledge of U.S. naval history.
Right.
You don't have to know about frigates and battleships. Did you intentionally write this book so that anyone can pick it up and be able to learn about this famous man?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I write anything without wanting people to understand it. You know, I guess that sounds kind of funny, but one of the funniest remarks in any review I've ever had of this book was, this book is written very curiously. It's well researched, but it's readable. And I thought, you know, what have we become if that's, you know, where we are? But yeah, I believed that if I just got out of the way, this was a story that anybody could relate to.
No, and again, I think you did a fine job with that. And yeah, but it's a history book. And we're both historians.
Yeah.
Now, and it is very dangerous to put two historians to talk about history at the same time, because you and I have done. We've talked for hours at a time about our craft and about the state of our field. But for the audience right now, would you just share an element of the historian's craft that you use to make this a distinctive work of scholarship?
Is that a personal question, or is that like a technical question?
Wow. Okay. So I want to give the readers the idea, like, yes, because you read it and you think anybody can read this, anybody can write this, but I don't know that anybody can sit down and do what you did. And so, like, what is it? What kind of tools did you use as a historian to make this book?
Okay, I can see that, right? I mean, I did the research for it, a lot of research here and there, and everywhere, and online, in person. The research was over COVID, so there was a lot of disruption there. But in the writing of it, I just wanted to be sure that he himself would like the way I was doing it. And I wanted to make sure that I sounded like I sound. You know, one of my favorite tools in writing is to actually compose sentences out loud.
Okay.
You know, and I do that in a car a lot. I have to pull over a lot, and I have to get my phone out and hit notes, you know, and hit record and dictate a sentence into it or a paragraph, and then incorporate that in, because I think that writing is just speaking. It's just communicating. And if you're turning off more people than you're turning on, then you're not communicating well.
Yeah.
think that's where I'm at.
No, I love that. No, thank you for that. And I love the way you just say that as if that's easy to do, right? But some of the times, one of the hardest things is for the writer to get out of the way, right? And so I love you giving us tips and tools that you use to actually do that. Now, when I was reading this, I wasn't quite sure if it's a biography, if it's a history of the Navy, if it's a history of U.S. expansion in East Asia. How would you describe this book?
I really like you asking me that, because that's what I want people to pick up on. It's a biography, but it's a biography in the same way that a skeleton is a person. You know, the biography is just the framework for the story. And that's why I love biography, because you can make biography do anything, right? If you have somebody that was born here and dies here, you've got an entire arc built in that you sort of don't have to construct yourself, and you can just hang stuff on it as you go. And that's why I think biography is so useful. I think that's why biography is so popular too. You know, somebody like McCullough, right, who writes these wonderful biographies, who I would love to be like, right? He understands that a biography is the most basic book there is. If you're a human reading it, right? If you're a human reading a book, the biography takes you halfway there already. Yeah.
No.
And I can hang stuff on it, like the history of the Navy is not an abstraction for him, right? The history of national expansion is not an abstraction for him. What it's like to be seasick is not an abstraction for him. And you can put all these things in if you just sort of trust that you'll get a chance to put in everything you want, because the life that you're telling is the story that you're thinking of.
Now, you mentioned earlier about like your voice, like wanting the book to sound like you. Would you mind for us like grabbing the book and reading for it? Let us hear you read a passage that you think we should hear, and maybe tell us, and maybe share a little bit about that passage. I've learned a lot, about writing and speaking, and I've learned that writing for speaking is different than writing for reading, because, I do that radio thing, and I can't write sentences like this to read on the radio, right? Because I write long sentences. I didn't realize this until I started trying to read them in one breath. But you're the only person in here who does that, I'm sure.
This is, you asked me to read something, and I thought, how am I going to read just one thing? I'm going to read a whole chapter. So that's the rest of our time.
And then we'll do Q&A after.
We'll do Q&A if we've got time. Right. I thought, what am I going to read? I thought, because I have different parts of this book that I really, really like. And they're very different. And I finally settled on this. And this is an episode during the Civil War on the Mississippi River, where Dewey is 24 years old. He's the executive officer of a ship called the Mississippi, which is a little bit confusing. And his captain is a guy named Melancton Smith, an old salt that's been around a long time. And Melancton Smith saw something in Dewey and gave him a lot of responsibility. So I'm gonna start, and then you stop me wherever you want. Or you all can stop me. At 3:30 in the morning on April 24th, after an interminable delay caused by various difficulties in raising anchors and dealing with broken ropes, the attack got underway. Dewey was at the helm of the Mississippi as it started forward, third in the right-hand column behind the Cayuga and the Pensacola. Behind the Mississippi came 5 lighter gunboats. All were under clear instruction to keep their lights masked so they couldn't be seen from shore. Admiral Farragut in the Hartford led the 2nd Division going upriver in column to Dewey's left. The right-hand column ships, including Dewey's Mississippi, were ordered not to fire their port guns, and the left-hand column ships were ordered not to fire their starboard guns so they wouldn't shoot each other. The only sounds were the muted chugging of steam engines and the noises of a sticky bayou spring night. "Do you know the channel, Dewey?" Captain Smith asked more than once as they closed in on the barrier up ahead. He had been opposed from the start to a nighttime attack, in part because he couldn't see well in the dark, and now he felt the weight of the responsibility he had delegated to his young subordinate. Dewey responded with as much reassurance as he could each time, all the while silently hoping not to run the ship aground. About 3:40 a.m., just as the Pensacola drew abreast of the forts, the eerie silence was shattered as the Confederates opened fire. They had been waiting. As smoke started to cloud the river, Smith turned to Dewey and told his young executive officer that he was going down to the gun deck to oversee the firing, so the navigation of the ship was left to him. "You have younger eyes," he said simply, and disappeared below decks. The Pensacola seemed to slow as it delivered its first crashing broadside into Fort St. Philip, and the distance between the ships quickly shrank. Dewey was close enough to the bank that he could hear the Confederate officers frantically yelling orders. Gunners both ashore and afloat loaded and fired as fast as they could, struggling to keep their composure and aim amid the wild, constant crash of incoming shot and shell. One crewman described the chaotic sensation like being in a violent hailstorm. Want me to keep going?
That's good.
That's good.
No, I can keep it going. Yeah, no, please. I mean, one of the things you do really well. I'm going to ask you to share why. Like, why that passage of all the ones you?
Okay.
But could you not see that, like, that description being late and this young naval officer? That is the way this book is throughout. David does this throughout. Wherever Dewey is, the reader is able, he allows us to place ourselves in those very spots. And I really appreciate that about the book. But why this passage? Like, why did you choose this passage?
You know, because it had dramatic possibilities. I like it, and and the story goes on, and there's fire ships being shoved around into other ships, and guns blazing, and rams hitting other ships. It's dramatic, and it's fun to read.
Yeah.
But there are other parts in it I like too, and some of the other parts that I like are not really dramatic. Some of them are sort of tedious, describing his day. He gets up at this hour, he has this for breakfast every day. And I thought, I read that to a crowd, they're going to wonder what they're going to have for lunch. So, it was either this, there are 1, 2, 3, there's like 3.5, 4 battle scenes in it. So I figured, I'll try a battle scene.
I thought it was beautiful. And again, it gave a really good example of the way in which you are such a wonderfully gifted writer at describing things. There's this one part in the book, and I'm totally off script here, but there's this one part in the book, I think, where you talk about where Dewey's his grave is, his gravesite, under the cathedral.
Oh yeah.
Right? And did you actually walk? Did you actually do?
Yeah.
And when you read the book, right, he's telling you how to find it. And David's telling you how difficult it is to find it. But as I'm reading it, I could see you actually walking the steps, actually getting lost, looking at a map.
It took me 30 minutes to find it, and it wasn't on the map.
No, and the reason I knew that is because I said, there's no way you could have written that had you not done that yourself. And it was beautiful. I mean, your descriptions in every situation are so phenomenal and so beautifully written. But I want to shift gears here, because we got to talk about history, right?
Yeah. Let me ask you a question.
Sure. See, now wait a minute. Someone said don't let him interview me, right?
You mentioned something that is applicable here.
Yes.
And I tell my classes this, and I got some students here, and some of them have probably heard me say this. The thing that you need in a history class, more than anything else, I tell them this on day one, and when I tell them, the thing that you need in this class, more
in
than
that voice,
else,
right? Yes.
Yeah, in that voice. And they think, is he going to say what, a pen or a pencil, whatever. Imagination. None of this is going to work unless you have imagination, because you're sitting in this classroom.
Yes.
In these comfortable seats that squeak when you lean back in them, and you've got other things on your mind, and you're wondering, what your next class is, you're wondering what the heck I'm going to talk about. Unless you can get yourself out of this room, you're not going to get this stuff. I don't know did I ever say that to your class? You know, and I believe that more than I believe anything else about this art. And that's what I don't need to tell you that the sounds of a sticky bayou night were on the Mississippi in April, but if I want the reader or the student to come along with me, I gotta bring them. I wonder if you do. I suspect you do that too.
I do try to do that in my writing, but I'm not going to fall for that trap and let you become the interviewer and be the interviewee.
It's a conversation.
No, yeah, no, it is a conversation, but I'll go off, and this is your book we're talking about. But I really do appreciate that. I love that you want to engage that. The Battle of Manila Bay.
Yeah.
Right? It's a central role. Like, it has its own, and I can't remember the chapter, but it's almost dead center in the book, right? I mean, it really
is.
So, so why don't you tell us about this battle? I mean, give us a description of it.
You know, the Battle of Manila Bay is one of the reasons that I wound up writing this book, because it has been in my history classes since the very beginning. And you know, I was sort of casting around for what do I want to write about, what do I want to devote myself to writing a book about, and I thought, you know, what am I interested in? What do I already talk about? And the Battle of Manila Bay is such a central and dramatic element of the entire transformation of the United States from a country that thinks of itself as looking inward to a country that realizes that it has been looking outward a long time. And it happened in the Spanish-American War in May of 1898. And it happened when all of the United States' attention was focused on Cuba in the Spanish-American War. That's where everybody thought the Spanish-American War was going to be fought. And suddenly, and there's obviously a story behind this, but Dewey finds himself on the far side of the Pacific, leading a squadron into Manila Bay, which is where the Spanish Pacific Fleet is, and taking it out entirely over the course of a Sunday morning. What did you ask me?
You're telling us about the Battle of Manila Bay, and my next question is, why was it so important then, as you were just saying, but why is it important that we remember that battle now?
It was and that's a question that I like to make myself answer slowly, because I don't want to jump to something. Yeah. That was the battle that showed the American people that they are a great power, that the country's a great power. And that, you know, you were talking about the transformation of the time, right? This is 1898. That's the battle that clued Americans into the fact that we as a country can now project power across the Pacific. And you know this, but we had grown up as an Atlantic country. And even as we went coast to coast, even as we got California, even as we had beaches that face west, we thought of ourselves as an Atlantic entity because we came out of the Atlantic world. That was always the route to the rest of the world. And suddenly, with the Battle of Manila Bay and the totality with which he destroyed the Spanish fleet, and with it, Spanish authority in a colony that they'd had since the 1500s, suddenly Americans realize, A, we've got a new hero. B, we have just gone across the Pacific and beaten a great power. And C, maybe we should hold on to the Philippines. So that's how we make that transition, right? It's like, if it were a symphony, right? The Battle of Manila Bay would either be the very last part of a movement or the opening measures of movement 2.
Now, I thought it was wonderfully done. And from that, Dewey becomes a celebrity, right?
Yeah.
And remind me, did people know him before this, or was this the battle that made?
Everybody didn't know. No, nobody knew him. I mean, he was known in the Navy as a very capable guy. He had done a bunch of ashore, afloat, right?
Yes.
He had had staff positions. He had had command positions, and in the Navy he was really well known. When he got the position as the head of the Bureau of Equipment, I think, the New York Times did a short story on him, and he said, you know, this is a top-notch officer, and the Bureau is going to be well served. But as far as the American public goes, they didn't know him from Adam. And it was only when the magnitude of the Battle of Manila Bay hit the newspapers, right, in this era of New York City having 18 newspapers, right, that suddenly he was catapulted into something completely different.
So, why Dewey? Like, why now? Why should we know about Dewey and learn about Dewey? What's a lesson from Dewey for our time?
Wow. That changes depending on my mood, I think.
Okay.
You know?
All right.
But the answer that I usually give is not the really expected one. Dewey shows you the flimsiness of celebrity. I mean, he was the biggest name in American history for a short time, and then he just fell off the radar entirely. And to his credit, he never bought into it. But you can't say that about every celebrity, right? I think we need to know him because he's a good example of the celebrity machine, right? You do one thing, you get your name in the paper, you get your pictures in the paper, you get your name on the Brooklyn Bridge in 10-foot electric lights,
Yes.
Then you become something other than a human. And the press lauded him and then turned against him and basically talked him into running for president, which was a catastrophe. And through it all, he sort of retains his humanity. And he says, I don't want to be a celebrity anyway.
One of the things that I noticed from the book is that, I mean, the book does, it oscillates between Dewey as a celebrity and then Dewey as falling into obscurity, right?
Yeah.
And I want to grab your book here for a second because there's a sentence
really?
that I thought, I want to ask you to read this because it just seemed to me like this was an important sentence for you to write. Like I got the sense,
Really?
you could tell me if I'm totally misreading this, right? That I just thought you were not going to close.
Wouldn't it be cool if this is a sentence that I remember writing?
But that you were not going to close this book before you wrote this. It's on 286.
Ooh.
It's in the epilogue.
Oh, wow.
And it begins over the course of the 20th century.
Oh, wow. That is a good sentence.
Yeah. So can you read it? Can you read it down to 9/11? Can you read it from over the course down to 9/11?
Yeah. Over the course of the 20th century, Americans distilled the life and career of George Dewey down to a few dramatic hours on a Sunday morning on the far side of the world. His life before and after Manila rapidly dissolved in the relentless solvent of a nation whose focus was always the future and for which history was limited to a catalog of discrete and disconnected moments of high drama. The sinking of the Lusitania, the stock market crash of 1929, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the assassination of John Kennedy, the terrorist attacks of 9/11.
What are you saying about our understanding of history in this country?
I'm saying in this sense, I couldn't have written this sentence unless I was a teacher.
Yeah.
You know, what I'm saying is that history is more than just dates. History is more than what you were made to learn in high school. History is more, by most teachers. I mean, you're okay, yeah. No. I know what you do, and it's not that. History is something that exists as an organic whole, and if you take it and you just chop it up into bite-sized pieces, you lose the point of it,
Yes.
right? It's not just 9/11. It's not just Pearl Harbor. It's not just the Battle of Manila Bay. It's everything that led up to that. One of my favorite writers used to say that when you get an event like Lexington and Concord, or the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, right? What you're seeing is a lightning flash that illuminates a scene that's already set. And in that flash, in that moment, 7:55 a.m. on Sunday, December 7th, you see the crystallization of everything that has happened before that has led you up to this. And if you want to just know it as a Trivial Pursuit answer, then fine. But if you really want to know it as something substantive, you've got to know everything that comes up to it.
Do you guys
That's a good
think? Do you guys think he really wanted to write that sentence? Like, no. When I read
Yeah.
that sentence, I said, I gotta get. I know
Yeah.
there's more to it. And so, this was the historian's voice. This was you saying this is what history is. And I gravitated to it, and I really want to thank you
appreciate
for
that.
it. Yeah.
I mean, the only time that I really sort of intruded on this
Yeah.
was in the introduction and the epilogue.
But I thought it was an important message to say.
Oh, yeah.
And I will say, I'm going to interject for a second. I think it is one thing that we do really well here at Baylor, and I think some of our students here, hopefully you can back me up on this, but I think we really do begin to shift their mind. Like, history is more than
Yeah.
dates and names. History is something that, and I think me and my colleagues in the history department do a great job of that,
Yeah.
and you are exemplary of that. I'm going to shift gears here for a second. There was a movie that maybe you may or may not have seen. It's a blockbuster movie, Top Gun Maverick.
Oh my goodness.
And Top Gun Maverick taught us that everyone in the Navy is beautiful.
us?
Yeah, everyone in the Navy is beautiful. They all fly jets off of aircraft carriers. And they spend their time playing these cool beach games with great soundtrack in the back, right?
Yes, they do.
So after we read A New Force at Sea,
Yeah?
what are you going to teach us about the Navy?
Oh my gosh. Well, it's all that.
Yes, yes.
I'm not going to say it's not all that. Right? I mean, that's a little bit hard in the days before aviation, but they made it work. What am I going to teach us about the Navy? Holy
Yeah.
smokes, man. Okay. Are you asking me, do I have a rebuttal to Top Gun Maverick?
No, not at all. There is a message. The Navy is a part of this story. You
Yeah,
couldn't have done this
sure.
story about the Navy. And what is something that someone who may not know much about the Navy, what is something that you want them to come away with knowing
wow,
about the
okay.
American Navy during this time period?
It is an organization that's made up of really deep-thinking theorists, really innovative technical minds, and at the same time, willful, capable, operational commanders. And to make it work as an institution, you have to have all those things. You have to have the thinkers, you have to have the theorists, you have to have the secretaries of the Navy who go in front of Congress and fuss for funding, right? And you have to have the commanders who are out there on the bridges of these ships who know strategically what they're up to and how operationally to bring those things about. How's that?
No, I think that's great. Because I think when most people think of the Navy, they see the ship.
Yeah.
Right, as if the ships are driving themselves and going to places. But one of the things you do really well in this, you talk about the importance. You talk about the importance of leadership.
Yeah.
You talk about the importance of the decision making
Yeah.
that goes into those, right? And I think
Yeah,
you do a
I
good.
can see that.
You do a really great job of that. On that note, do you have your book?
I do.
There's a
Open your
passage.
hymnals to page.
I know, right? The total Baptist in me, right? So there is on page the bottom of page 38,
Oh.
going into 39.
Ooh.
It starts. How's it start? It starts every time.
Oh, yeah.
And every time. And I want you to go to. And only secondly, a man in the world. But start
Oh, yeah,
every
okay.
time. Yeah.
Every time Dewey's foot passed from the solid, unchanging earth to the gently moving wooden deck of a ship, his world grew larger, his vision of life broader. The Academy was serving another, more subtle purpose for its students as well, transforming their perspective from provincial to national to ultimately, for the lack of a better term, global. When one becomes a midshipman, Dewey explained later, you cease to be a Vermonter or a Georgian or a Californian. You are in the Navy. Your future, with its sea service and its frequent changes of assignment, makes you first a man of the country's service, and only secondly, a man of the world.
Would you? First of all, I really love that passage. And you talk about when he puts this growth that he goes through. Like,
Yeah.
So talk about Annapolis. Talk about his time at the Naval Academy and how that changed this young man
Yeah.
from Vermont into the man that we're going to see.
You know, he had something of a rebellious streak. You know, he was not a fall in line kind of kid. And he was his father's third son. And his father was this extraordinarily respectable person in Montpelier. And George Dewey didn't want to do that. He wanted to do his own thing, and he was defiant, and he caused a lot of trouble. And his father worried a lot about him. You know, what is the future of this kid going to be? And what he learned at Annapolis was what his mission could be in life. He was turned on to stuff that he didn't realize he was interested in. He was exposed to things that he didn't know he would respond to like he did. There's a great scene in there when he's basically out on the bay for the first time on one of the Navy's training ships, and it's heeled over, you know, and the water is hitting him in the face and the breeze, and it's transformative, right? He never experienced this before. And it teaches him responsibility. It teaches him how big the world is. I think that's it.
Yeah, and these are his college years, right? So he's 18,
absolutely,
19,
yeah.
20, 21, right?
Yeah.
So what does that say? Let's say a student is reading this book.
Oh, yeah.
And they're not perfect. They don't get all A's. They don't do, like, what does that say to a college student? Is their career over? Are they never going to be much in the world?
It hasn't even started yet. I mean, I was George Dewey. You know, I don't even want to tell you what my undergrad years were like. You know, all 8 of them.
That's our next interview.
Yeah. But the message is, what you need to do is find where you're supposed to be, and from that point on, you don't work anymore, right? And you have to be able to expect that from an unexpected direction. You have to be open to it. And I think growing up, if you had told Dewey, guess what? You're going to be the captain of a ship and you're going to be, you know, all over the world, he would say, you're out of your mind, right? But he was open to it, and it clicked at the right time for him. And students today need that.
It was kind of a plant, and you said everything I was hoping you would say to our students, because I do think, as I read it, like we don't encourage any behavior, but in this book there are demerits, there's fights. I mean, he was not, but yet he was not one to toe the line.
Yeah,
So here at Baylor, right? So here at Baylor, we got 2 ROTC units. We got the Army and the Air Force. He's sporting the colors, yes. So like if this book was used to train future officers, what's a lesson of leadership you want them to gain from Dewey?
Wow, holy smokes. A lesson of leadership. Leadership is something that is honed over time. And leadership is something that you develop the capacity to exert through some pretty tough experiences, right? You don't just say you're a leader.
Yes.
You know, it's not easy at all. It's something that he became over the course of everything. You know, he almost dies in here, you know, a couple of times, you know, during war, then he gets sick. And it's something that builds up with his sense of duty, with his sense of sort of stick-with-itness, and the support that he got from just enough people to stay with it. Leadership is something that grows rather than something that just appears. I think that's pretty good.
I think that's pretty good too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in a book about the Navy, one thing that surprised me was the importance of place, and in particular, Vermont. Like, Vermont plays a huge role in this book and in the life. What was the role? Like, for a man who spent his adulthood life on the seas and in some of the world's most famous port cities, and in some of the country's biggest battles, why was it so important for you to introduce your readers to Vermont, to his home place?
Well, the simple answer to that was because it was important to him. And it was part of who he was his whole life. So the reader, if you want to know Dewey, you've got to know that he has this sense of connection to a place. And I think that especially in his world, I mean, he traveled literally all over the world. And he saw stuff that over the course of a lifetime that would have been hard to see over the course of an earlier lifetime, you know? And that him having this sense that he belongs someplace is critical to giving him the freedom to become what he became. I hope somebody wrote that down, because that came out better than I thought it would.
That was really good. That was really, no, that was really good.
I had my doubts when I started that sentence. Yeah, that's what it is. It's liberating.
I want you to put your book back up for a second, because there's another sentence in here on page 22 that I found really good. I found a bunch of them good, but it's the sentence on 22 that begins, "To my father's influence." Read that in the next sentence after, if you don't mind.
Just those first two sentences?
Yeah.
To my father's influence in my early training, I owe primarily all that I have accomplished in the world, to be explained with gratitude years later. From him, I inherited a vigorous constitution and an active temperament.
You talk a lot in this book about Dr. Julius Dewey, his father.
Yeah.
Why was it so important? What was the role of this father and son relationship in his life?
Boy, it was a weird relationship.
Yeah.
You know, Dr. Dewey it must have been hard. You know, I didn't have this kind of relationship. I had a great relationship with my dad, but Dr. Dewey was like the big man in Montpelier, right? He was a doctor. He was well connected. He knew everybody in the Vermont state legislature. He was the epitome of respectableness. And that's easy to rebel against. And I think, and I don't want to speak for Julius Dewey too much, and I don't want to downplay what he did, because man, he worried about George a lot. Because he didn't have to worry about George's older brothers, because they towed the line perfectly, right? They went into business and they became wonderful. He didn't give up on him. They had a distant relationship. I don't like how distant they were, right? His mom dies when he's 5. And Dr. Dewey tries really hard for quite a while to be both a father and a mother. And then he gets remarried. And George and his younger sister Mary feel a gulf open there. But you never get the sense that Julius Dewey, Dr. Dewey, ever just wrote off his son.
Yeah.
And he lived to see him be a success, and I like that.
And David, we got to open it up to Q&A here, but I got one last question, just short.
Well, this counts as Q.
What did you What did you learn about David A. Smith in writing this book?
Oh. I learned how to better relate to other people. I learned, and if you know me, you're going to think I'm making this up. I learned how to better relate to people in authority. I learned about. Does it sound too cheesy if I just say humanity? I learn about what makes people tick.
Yeah.
And I know that it's not the same for everybody.
Yeah.
And well, I've never been asked that question. And I'm not all keen on introspective me questions, right? I'd rather talk about Dewey than me.
Yeah, but I get to ask the question.
You get to ask the question. I'm going to get back at you later.
Well, listen, with that, why don't we open it? First of all, would you guys help me thank David for a lovely conversation? Thank you.
And thank you.
Yeah. And why don't we open it up to the floor? Yes, right here.
It's a microphone. Trust
really,
it.
yeah.
So from everyone in history, like American naval history, and from John Paul Jones to Nimitz, what made Dewey stand out in specific for this book? Like, why do you want to write this?
I really am glad that you use those two people. You work on your arm. I'm glad that you said John Paul Jones in the American Revolution, Chester Nimitz in World War II, right? Dewey is important because his career spanned the gulf between those two things. His career encompassed more change and innovation and transformation both in the life of the Navy and in the life of the country than either of those other two did, even Nimitz. And Nimitz saw a lot, but Dewey saw more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have like 10 questions, but I'm going to try and limit myself to one.
Don't believe it.
I know this guy. I have one question in 10 parts.
So, is there a moment in Dewey's life where he moves from thinking like a tactician who fights battles to someone who thinks strategically?
Yes.
What is that moment?
I would say that I like that question a lot. And part of it has to be sort of speculative.
Maybe explain what tactics and strategy are.
Well, tactics is what happens when two fighting forces interact, right? The fighting and the maneuvering for position, me and you, is tactics, right? Tactics is what happens when you and I play one-on-one basketball. A strategy is how you're going to have the right kind of forces in the right place with the right support and what you want to do with these forces in the broader world. And there's an episode in the book, and this is in the 1870s. It's during the first stages of the Cuban Revolution, and there has been an episode in the Caribbean in which the Spanish have captured an American ship that was running guns to the Cuban rebels. And the Spanish general started executing the American prisoners. Dewey at this point is in the command of a ship in the Gulf of California, all right, doing survey work. And his crew was all glum because if there's action, they're not going to be able to take part in it because they're on the Pacific, it's in the Caribbean. And he said, don't worry, if we go to war with Spain, the Narragansett, which I think is the name of the ship then, we will take Manila. And it's nutty. I mean, it's a preposterous boast. But it shows that he's making a connection between what happens in the Caribbean and what can happen to influence events in the Caribbean across the Pacific. Right? By the time you get to the 1890s, and you've got institutions in the Navy thinking strategically, that's them catching up to the insight that he had back in the 70s and early 80s. So I think if there's one moment that, I don't think that's the moment that he gets it, but I think that's the first moment that you see him thinking that way. And that's, I think, more personal.
First of all, just a note that Admiral Dewey did not fade entirely into obscurity.
Certainly not.
There's a man,
other soldiers do that.
A good friend of mine in my church, not very much older than I am, who was given the middle name of Dewey by his father in honor of Admiral George Dewey.
I know a dog named Dewey. I like to pretend his name for George Dewey.
The question, it follows on the one that Professor Campbell just asked. You divided military officers, maybe particularly naval officers, into the thinkers and the commanders.
Okay.
The other uniformed naval officer that I think we most remember from that era is someone that you and I have had a lot to do with, Alfred Thayer Mahan. Did Dewey ever enter into that larger strategic debate, grand strategy I'm talking about now, in response to or entirely independently of Mahan, about the way that military and naval power can shape and reshape the entire world order and create the environment within which a nation has to make its policy?
Yeah. I guess I'll tell you now that a biography of Mahan is my next book. So I'm already working on it. And Alfred Thayer Mahan is this naval thinker that transforms the way that navies think about their role in grand strategy, the biggest strategic stage. Dewey and Mahan knew each other. I don't think they personally liked each other too much. They weren't enemies, although Mahan had this habit of grousing when Dewey got commands that he thought he should have. But to answer your question shortly, it's no. Dewey understood that there were thinkers doing what Mahan was doing. And there were people writing books and books and books and articles and articles and articles about this transformative strategic vision. Dewey never thought of himself that way. He thought, my job is to take strategic thought and put it into action. And then, he becomes the first president of the first strategic planning board that the Navy has. And even then, he thought of his role more as, I'm going to legitimize this action by my presence here, rather than me dipping my feet into strategic planning, because by that point, he thought he was past his prime. But he never, I don't think, he always sort of divided, like you said, he divided officers into the thinkers and the doers, and he was a doer. No pun intended. He got called Mr. Doer by one of his commanding officers in the Civil War. The whole time, Mr. Doer, he never corrected him. Which I guess there's probably a lesson there.
So my question revolves around, throughout history, especially with Dewey, we've seen military leaders like generals become, as you said, celebrities of sorts.
Yeah.
What do you think is the main change, as we don't see that often happen now? Do you think it's a change in war, the way presence, media has just changed and it's spread, or something like that?
I think it's a couple of different things. I think it is the fact that the armed forces are smaller now than they ever were. We were talking about this in class the other day, right? There were, just in the Army, there were 11.8 million people in World War II. That's a big group from which to take political leaders in the subsequent decades. I think part of it is that the armed forces aren't as big as they used to be. Our fleets aren't as big, our divisions aren't as numerous, right? There's a smaller pool of potential military leaders that come out. The military leaders that come out today stay on the private lecture circuit and get a whole bunch of money for giving talks. I think that's part of it, and I'm not sure that by and large the military is seen as central an expression of American culture and identity as it used to be. Because now we pay attention to the people who happen to be ex-military officers who are celebrities, but then they were people first, I think. I think that's the end of the answer.
Last question.
You talked about at the end how when writing your book, one thing that you learned most was about humanity and about how what makes people tick. I've heard modern philosophers say that the best way to study psychology is to study history. As a well-established professor, could you add on to that? Maybe why do you think that is?
I couldn't say that any better. I mean, that's. I don't think you can understand algebra without understanding history. You know, there's nothing that exists that doesn't have a history.
Yes.
And I sincerely believe, and people think I'm a nut, but if you really want to understand something, understand its history. And that goes with people above all. And I think philosophy too, because philosophy is just, I don't know what philosophy is, but I came close there for just a minute.
You did.
But yeah, I think that, was your question, does history count behind all things?
No, it was...
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, why is psychology, why is the best way to study psychology?
Yeah, because psychology is about people, and you learn about people through their history, and people interact with, people are the way they are because they've had a history. Me and you and Dr. Clinton, we've all had specific histories that have brought us to this moment right here. And if you want to understand how somebody's mind works, look at their story.
Dr. Burke.
Can we do this again later?
I know, right?
We're just getting warmed up.
I felt a little bit like we were led into a little conversation in the lunchroom over in Tidwell between two historians. If I may, I would like to ask one final question.
Please do.
The hymn sung at George Dewey's funeral, "Lead, kindly light, amidst this encircling gloom, lead thou me on. The night is dark and I am far from home, lead thou me on.
Yeah.
Keep thou my feet, I do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for me." I'm wondering why you included this.
Well, when you read through the whole book, you'll notice there's a lot of music in here. Because Dewey loved music. He loved theater, he loved the opera, he loved music. He grew up with it. He couldn't sing, but he loved music. And he often found meaning in things like that. And at dramatic points throughout the whole book, I drop in songs. And I thought that because this is one of his favorite hymns, and when the night is dark and I am far from home, you know that he felt that line deeper than anybody else. And it's meant to make the reader stop and reflect and have an emotional reaction.
Right. Thank you so much. Could I one more round of applause for our author and for Dr. Johnson. And I want to invite you to the next Reader Meet the Author on April 11th, where we will feature Philip Jenkins' new book, A Storm of Images, Iconoclasm, and Religious Reformation in the Byzantine World. And he will be interviewed by Beth Barr in the History Department. So I hope I will see you there. There are books in the back. You might be able to get one penned. And there are cookies and coffee. So enjoy one another, and thanks again for being here.